Welcome to this journey into one of Missouri's most disturbing and deeply buried secrets. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. What time is it where you're watching this? Are you alone? Tell me in the comments below, because what we're about to uncover together happened in a place not so different from where many of you might be sitting at this very moment. A quiet place. An isolated place. A place where screams would never reach the nearest neighbor. This is the story of the Turner brothers and the woman who was never allowed to leave them. The year was 1893. Missouri had been a state for 72 years, but vast stretches of its interior remained wild, disconnected, governed more by family law than federal oversight. In the southwestern corner of the state, near the border with Kansas and the Indian Territory that would later become Oklahoma, there existed a patchwork of farming communities so remote that the nearest town with a post office lay 14 miles away by unpaved road. Mail came once a week if the weather cooperated. The law came almost never. It was here, in a settlement that no longer appears on any modern map, that the Turner family maintained a property of approximately 600 acres. The land had been in the family since 1857, passed from father to son with the kind of obsessive territoriality that isolated families develop when they've convinced themselves the outside world has nothing to offer them. The Turner homestead sat at the end of a long dirt path that wound through dense oak and hickory forest, invisible from any main road, accessible only to those who knew exactly where to look. John Turner, 32 years old in the spring of 1893, was the eldest son and the patriarch after his father's death 2 years prior. His younger brother Jacob, 28, had never left the property, never married, never shown any inclination toward independence. The two men worked the land together, appeared in town together on the rare occasions they ventured beyond their borders, and spoke in the abbreviated language of people who have spent too many years in each other's exclusive company. In April of that year, John Turner traveled alone to the nearby community of Hartwell Springs, a collection of perhaps 40 families clustered around a general store and a Baptist church. He carried with him a letter of introduction from a distant cousin and a photograph of himself standing beside a plow horse. Within 3 weeks, he had arranged a marriage with Samantha Russell, the 19-year-old daughter of a widowed farmer whose land had failed and whose options had run out. The marriage was conducted on May 7th, 1893, in the front room of the Russell family's rented cottage. No guests attended beyond Samantha's father and 2 younger siblings. Jacob Turner stood beside his brother throughout the ceremony, which the visiting minister later described as unusually brief and curiously tense. Samantha Russell wore a dress borrowed from a neighbor. She signed her name in the marriage registry with careful, practiced letters. By all accounts, she did not smile. The Turner brothers departed with their new bride before sunset, driving a wagon loaded with Samantha's few possessions up the long road toward the forest. Her father watched from the porch until they disappeared. He would never see his daughter again. But that isn't the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is what Samantha Russell discovered on her wedding night. The strangest part is what waited for her in the bedroom of the Turner homestead, when both brothers entered the room and John Turner calmly explained that the marriage had been contracted for both of them, that Samantha now belonged to the Turner family, not to any individual man, that this was how things had always been done, how his father had arranged things, how his grandfather before him had maintained the family line. The strangest part is that Samantha Russell was not the first woman to enter this arrangement. And if the fragments of evidence we've assembled are accurate, she would not be the last. What happened in that isolated farmhouse over the following months remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in Missouri's archives of the forgotten. But we have pieces. We have whispers. We have documentation that was never meant to survive. And we have questions that have never been answered. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening here, because this story is just beginning, and it only gets darker from here. To understand what happened to Samantha Russell, we first need to understand the world she entered. 1893 Missouri was not a monolithic place. In cities like St. Louis and Kansas City, electric streetlights were beginning to replace gas lamps, telephone lines connected businesses, and newspapers reported on national politics and international events. But in the rural interior, especially in the isolated pockets of the Ozark foothills and the dense forest regions near the western border, a different reality prevailed. These isolated farming communities operated on systems that predated statehood. Extended family networks controlled land, water rights, and local commerce. Disputes were settled privately. Marriages were arranged with the same pragmatic calculation as livestock breeding. Women and children were considered family property in practice if not in law, and the nearest county sheriff might be a 3-day ride away, assuming he could be bothered to intervene in what he would dismiss as domestic matters. The Turner family had arrived in Missouri in the 1850s, part of a wave of settlement that pushed westward in search of affordable land and isolation from increasingly regulated Eastern society. Family records, fragmentary as they are, suggest they came originally from Kentucky, possibly before that from Virginia. They were not wealthy, but they were land-rich, and in these communities, land was the only currency that truly mattered. By the time John and Jacob Turner reached adulthood, the family had developed a reputation for extreme privacy. They did not attend church services, though they claimed Baptist affiliation when pressed. They did not participate in communal barn raisings or harvest festivals. They purchased supplies in bulk during infrequent town visits and disappeared back into their forest property for months at a time. Neighbors described them as polite but cold, functional but fundamentally strange. One detail appears repeatedly in the scattered historical accounts we've been able to locate. The Turner men were never seen with women, not at social gatherings, not in town, not even in the company of female relatives. This absence was notable enough that several contemporary sources comment on it. In an era when unmarried men of property were expected to court local daughters with some regularity, the Turner brothers seemed to exist in a state of deliberate bachelorhood that struck their neighbors as unnatural. But they were not bachelors. That's what the evidence eventually revealed. The first hint of something wrong appears in an 1881 letter written by a traveling Methodist minister named Reverend Isaiah Blackwood. The letter, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, describes Blackwood's attempt to visit the Turner property during a circuit-riding mission to bring religious services to isolated families. He was turned away at the property line by a man he identifies as the Elder Turner, who informed him that the family required no spiritual guidance and preferred not to be disturbed. But in the letter, Reverend Blackwood notes something that troubled him enough to commit it to paper. As he turned his horse to leave, he glimpsed a woman standing in the window of the second floor of the Turner house. She appeared young, pale, and she pressed her hand against the glass in what Blackwood described as a gesture of such desperate supplication that it haunts my sleep even now. When Blackwood asked the elder Turner about the woman, he was told she was the family's housekeeper, a widow from a neighboring county who preferred solitude. The explanation was delivered in a tone that made clear no further questions would be tolerated. Blackwood rode away. He made a note in his journal, but took no further action. 30 miles of forest separated him from the nearest authorities, and he had no evidence of wrongdoing, only an uncomfortable feeling and a glimpsed face in a window. This was how things disappeared in the rural interior. This was how women vanished into private hells that no official record would ever acknowledge. The Turner patriarch, known to contemporaries as Old Thomas Turner, died in the winter of 1891. His death certificate, filed in the county seat, lists the cause as heart failure. He was 67 years old. The certificate was signed by a local doctor who later admitted he had not actually examined the body, but had certified the death based on the son's description of symptoms. This was not uncommon practice in remote areas where calling a doctor meant a day's travel or more. With Old Thomas's death, the property passed to John Turner as the elder son, and it was shortly after assuming control that John began the process of finding a wife. But here's what the historical record suggests, pieced together from land deeds, marriage certificates, and fragmentary census data. Old Thomas Turner had also married later in life. His wife, Mary Ann Turner, appears in the 1870 census as residing at the Turner property. She was 23 years old to his 46. By the 1880 census, 10 years later, Mary Ann Turner no longer appears in any public record. She is not listed in the household. No death certificate exists. No grave marker has ever been located. She simply disappears from documentation, and another woman, identified in one fragmented county record as M. Turner, housekeeper, appears living at the property in the 1885 tax assessment. The pattern becomes clear only in retrospect, when you know what to look for. The Turner men did not remain bachelors. They brought women to the property in arrangements that were never publicly acknowledged, never formally documented, never subject to the social oversight that might have protected those women or even confirmed their continued existence. And when John Turner arrived in Hartwell Springs in April of 1893, seeking a bride, he was not breaking with family tradition. He was continuing it. Samantha Russell's father, William Russell, was a man with few options and many debts. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, leaving him with 3 children and a 40-acre farm that barely produced enough to feed them. When John Turner made his offer, it must have seemed like a solution, even a respectable one. A daughter married to a man of property, one less mouth to feed, one less dowry to scrape together. The marriage contract was standard for the period. William Russell signed over custody of his daughter to John Turner in exchange for the cancellation of a $50 debt owed to the general store where the Turners held credit. Samantha Russell had no say in the arrangement. She was 19 years old, literate, described by a teacher who knew her as quiet and dutiful. She had never traveled more than 20 miles from the place she was born. On May 7th, she entered a wagon with 2 men she barely knew and rode into a forest from which she would never emerge, at least not in any form that could tell her story. The first indication that something was wrong came exactly 4 months after the wedding. In early September of 1893, William Russell made the long journey to the Turner property to visit his daughter. He arrived unannounced, which would prove to be a critical detail. According to Russell's own testimony, given years later to a county investigator, he found the property gate locked with a heavy chain. When he called out, John Turner emerged from the tree line carrying a rifle. Turner told Russell that Samantha was unwell and could not receive visitors. When Russell insisted on seeing his daughter, Turner's response was unambiguous. He raised the rifle and told Russell to leave the property and not return. William Russell, described in contemporary accounts as a mild-mannered man broken by poverty and loss, did not challenge an armed man on his own land. He rode away. But his concern deepened in the following weeks when no word came from Samantha, no letters arrived, no messages were passed through mutual acquaintances. In October, Russell appealed to the county sheriff, a man named Clayton Merritt, asking him to investigate. Sheriff Merritt's response was documented in his official log, now preserved in the County Historical Society. He wrote that he saw no grounds for investigation into what appeared to be a domestic disagreement, that married women often became estranged from their birth families, and that William Russell should respect his daughter's new household arrangements. Russell made no further official appeals, but he did speak to neighbors, and through these conversations, fragments of a disturbing pattern began to emerge. A farmer named Dutch Henriksen, whose property adjoined the Turner land on the eastern boundary, reported seeing smoke rising from the Turner property at strange hours, particularly late at night. More disturbingly, he claimed to have heard sounds carrying through the forest on still evenings. Screaming, he said, a woman screaming. But sound travelled strangely in those dense woods, and when he mentioned it to his wife, she told him it was probably wildcats or wind. Through the trees, Henriksen had been hearing those sounds for years, he admitted, long before Samantha Russell arrived. Another neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Abigail Porter, recalled encountering Jacob Turner at the general store in November of that year. She had asked after his new sister-in-law a courtesy question. Jacob Turner's response struck her as odd enough that she mentioned it to several people. He said, and this is a direct quote from her later testimony, "Samantha is adjusting to family ways. She'll be fine once she understands how things are done proper." The phrasing troubled Mrs. Porter. The emphasis on adjustment and understanding, the suggestion that Samantha's well-being was conditional on her acceptance of circumstances. But what could she do? What could anyone do in a place and time where a married woman's fate was her husband's business and no one else's? The winter of 1893 passed with no further sightings of Samantha Russell. The Turner brothers made their infrequent trips to town for supplies, but always came alone. When asked about Samantha, their responses were vague and varied. She was pregnant and resting. She was ill with winter fever. She preferred solitude. She was helping with indoor work. The explanations were plausible enough, especially for a new bride in a rural household. Pregnancy, illness, and heavy domestic labor were common realities. People accepted the explanations because challenging them would require imagining, something so dark that it seemed impossible, even in that hard and often brutal time. But spring came, and still no one saw Samantha Russell. In April of 1894, exactly 1 year after John Turner had traveled to Hartwell Springs to arrange the marriage, a troubling discovery was made by a pair of hunters tracking deer through the forest south of the Turner property. They found, half buried in leaf litter near a creek bed, a woman's shoe. It was a simple leather shoe, the kind worn for daily work, sized for a small foot. Nearby they found fragments of fabric, dark blue cotton, that might have been part of a dress. The hunters brought the shoe to town. Several women examined it. One, a seamstress named Helen Cutler, recognized the stitching. She had repaired a pair of shoes for Samantha Russell 2 years earlier, before the girl's marriage. The distinctive crossed-stitch technique on the heel was hers. William Russell was shown the shoe. He confirmed it had belonged to his daughter. Sheriff Merritt was presented with this evidence. He agreed to visit the Turner property and inquire about Samantha's welfare. His visit, documented in a brief official report, occurred on April 23, 1894. John Turner met him at the gate and allowed him onto the property. They spoke in the yard. Turner explained that Samantha had left the property several weeks earlier, returning to her father's home because she found farm life too difficult. He seemed surprised that she had not arrived there. Sheriff Merritt asked to see the interior of the house. Turner refused, citing his rights as a property owner. Merritt, lacking any legal grounds for a forced search and facing 2 men on their own land, did not press the issue. He filed his report stating that Mrs. Samantha Turner's whereabouts were unknown, but that no evidence of foul play had been established. William Russell insisted that his daughter had never arrived at his home. He swore she would never have walked away from her marriage without word to him, would never have traveled alone through that dangerous forest. He begged for a more thorough investigation. His appeals were denied. The matter was considered closed. Samantha Russell had left her husband's home, and wherever she had gone afterward was her own business. Women sometimes ran away from marriages. It happened, especially with young brides unprepared for the harsh realities of farm life. This was the official conclusion. This was how the matter was left. But the shoe remained, and the fragments of blue dress remained, and the questions that William Russell could not stop asking remained, echoing through that small community until his death in 1902. What happened to Samantha Russell between May of 1893 and April of 1894? What occurred in that isolated farmhouse that convinced her to flee or made fleeing impossible? And if she did try to escape, why did she only make it as far as the creek bed south of the property before her trail vanished completely? The official record falls silent here, but the unofficial record, the whispered stories and fragmentary evidence that accumulated over decades, suggests something far more disturbing than a simple runaway bride. Tell me in the comments what you think happened to Samantha, because the story we've told so far is only the surface. The true horror lies in what was discovered decades later, when the Turner property finally gave up some of its secrets, and those secrets suggest that Samantha Russell was not the first woman to vanish into the Turner household, and she was far from the last. The first major break in understanding what happened at the Turner property came not from official investigation, but from accident and time. In 1937, 44 years after Samantha Russell disappeared, the old Turner homestead was finally abandoned. John Turner had died in 1922. Jacob Turner had died in 1935. The property, heavily in tax arrears, was seized by the county and sat empty for 2 years before being purchased by a family named Morrison, who planned to clear the land for cattle grazing. When the Morrisons began clearing the house in preparation for demolition, they found the structure in severe decay. The roof had partially collapsed. Water damage had rotted through the floors. The basement, or what passed for a basement in that hastily constructed farmhouse, was flooded with several inches of standing water. It was in this basement, wedged between collapsed floor joists and waterlogged debris, that Thomas Morrison found a leather-bound book. The book was severely damaged. Most of the pages had fused together or dissolved into pulp, but approximately 15 pages near the middle of the book remained partially legible, protected by their position in the binding. The book was a diary, and the entries, written in a careful feminine hand that degraded into desperate scrawling in the later pages, told a story of unimaginable suffering. The diary was not Samantha Russell's. The dates in the surviving pages ranged from June through September of 1886, 7 years before Samantha's marriage to John Turner. The writer never gives her full name in the surviving text, referring to herself only as M in several entries. Based on linguistic analysis and handwriting studies conducted in the 1970s, experts believe the writer was between 20 and 30 years old, literate but not highly educated, and writing in conditions of extreme psychological distress. The surviving entries are fragmentary, but their content is chilling. In an entry dated June 14, 1886, the writer describes her first weeks in what she calls this house of sorrows. She writes, and I'm reading from the preserved transcript because the original document is too fragile for regular handling, she writes. They tell me this is my duty now, both of them. I cannot write the details of what they demand. It is not marriage as I understood it. It is something older and darker. When I tried to object, the younger one struck me. When I tried to leave, they locked the doors. The entries continue through the summer months, each one documenting increasing desperation. The writer describes being confined to the house, forbidden from approaching windows when supply wagons passed on the distant road. She describes being forced to work in the fields only at dawn or dusk, when visibility was low and discovery unlikely. She describes, in veiled language that still communicates horror, the sexual arrangement forced upon her by both brothers. But it's an entry from late August that provides the most disturbing revelation. The writer describes finding items hidden in a crawl space beneath the kitchen floor. A woman's hairbrush, a locket containing a faded photograph, a wedding ring, inscribed with a date from 1876, 10 years before the diary writer arrived at the property. "I am not the first," she writes. "There was another before me, and I fear there will be another after me. Old Thomas told me yesterday that I'm failing in my purpose. I do not know what he means by this, but his tone filled me with cold terror. They speak sometimes of the family line, of maintaining what must be maintained, of obligations that transcend ordinary morality. I think they mean to keep me here until I produce a son, and if I cannot, I think they mean to replace me." The final legible entry is dated September 22, 1886. It consists of only one line: "I will try tonight. God forgive me if I fail." What M attempted that night is not recorded. The diary ends there. But we know from the discovery of the diary itself, abandoned in a flooded basement, that whatever she tried resulted in failure. The diary was left behind. And M herself vanishes from all historical records after 1886, just as Mary Ann Turner, the woman married to old Thomas Turner, vanishes from census records after 1880. The Morrison family, horrified by their discovery, turned the diary over to local authorities. A brief investigation was launched, but with both John and Jacob Turner dead, no criminal charges could be filed. The diary was archived. The property was cleared. The house was demolished. But the diary had opened a door to darker questions. If M was writing in 1886, and if she referenced another woman who came before her, then the pattern of bringing women to the Turner property and holding them in some form of forced servitude extended back at least to the 1870s, perhaps longer. How many women had disappeared into that isolated farmhouse, and what had become of them? The demolition of the Turner house in 1938 revealed more than anyone expected. As workers cleared the foundation, they uncovered signs of extensive digging in the area behind what had been the kitchen. The soil was disturbed, layered with inconsistent strata that suggested repeated excavation and refilling over many years. The Morrison family, increasingly disturbed by what they were finding, requested that county authorities examine the site. A deputy sheriff and 2 volunteers spent 3 days carefully excavating the area behind the old foundation. They found graves, 7 of them, unmarked, shallow, arranged in a rough line that ran north to south behind where the house had stood. The county lacked the resources for proper forensic examination in 1938, but the graves were carefully excavated and their contents documented as thoroughly as the era's limited technology allowed. The remains were in various states of preservation, depending on soil conditions and depth of burial. But several crucial details emerged. All 7 graves contained female remains. Age. Estimates ranged from late teens to early 30s. Several showed evidence of repeated pregnancies based on pelvic bone analysis. One skeleton showed clear signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. Another had a fractured jaw that had healed poorly, suggesting it had broken and reset without proper medical attention. But the most disturbing discovery was what accompanied several of the bodies. Personal items buried with them. A tarnished wedding ring in one grave, fragments of a blue cotton dress in another, a broken locket, a child's toy carved from wood, and in the grave farthest from the house, buried the deepest, they found a shoe, a woman's leather work shoe with distinctive crossed-stitch repair on the heel. The county coroner at the time, Dr. Henry Walsh, documented these findings in a report that would not become public for another 30 years. In his notes, preserved in county archives, Dr. Walsh wrote, "It is my professional opinion that these women were held against their will, subjected to repeated physical abuse, and died under circumstances that warrant criminal investigation. However, with the primary suspects deceased and no living witnesses, prosecution is impossible. I recommend the remains be given proper Christian burial and the case be documented for historical record." The 7 women were buried in the county cemetery in a shared plot. A single stone marker was placed, reading only, "7 unknown women, found 1938. May they rest in peace." But one detail from Dr. Walsh's examination was not included in his official report, only appearing in his private notes, discovered after his death in 1963. In examining the skull of the youngest victim, estimated to be between 18 and 20 years old at time of death, Dr. Walsh noted evidence of perimortem injury consistent with hanging. The hyoid bone was fractured in a way that suggested either strangulation or suspension by the neck. In his private notes, Dr. Walsh speculated that the young woman might have taken her own life, or that her death had been staged to appear that way. That youngest skeleton, buried deepest and farthest from the house, has never been positively identified. But the crossed-stitch shoe, the fragments of blue cotton dress, and the estimated age all align with what we know of Samantha Russell. She was 19 years old when she disappeared. She wore shoes repaired with distinctive stitching. She was last seen wearing a blue cotton dress. The shoe found by hunters in April 1894 was her left shoe. The shoe found in the grave in 1938 was the matching right shoe. If that grave belongs to Samantha Russell, then we know she survived at the Turner property for approximately 11 months after her wedding. We know she was buried far from the house, suggesting her death or disposal occurred after an attempted escape. We know she was buried with some care, her possessions placed with her body, which suggests the Turner brothers maintained some vestige of ritual or guilt in their actions. But we don't know how she died. We don't know if the hanging evidence indicates suicide or murder. We don't know what those 11 months contained, what daily horrors she endured, what hopes kept her alive, or what final horror extinguished them. The 7 graves behind the Turner house represent 7 women whose names are mostly lost to history. 7 women who entered that property as wives or captives and never left. 7 women who were buried in secret and would have remained secret forever if the house hadn't finally fallen to ruin. But even this revelation was not the end of the story, because decades later, more evidence would surface. Evidence that the Turner brothers' activities might have extended beyond their own property. Evidence that the dark pact they maintained might have been part of something larger, something that implicated others in their isolated community. In 1972, a historian named Dr. Margaret Chen was researching patterns of frontier justice and extra-legal settlements in 19th century Missouri for her doctoral dissertation. While examining records at the County Historical Society, she discovered a locked storage box that had been donated to the society in 1946 by the estate of a deceased attorney named Virgil Summers. The box had been catalogued but never properly examined. When Dr. Chen obtained permission to open it, she found a collection of correspondence, legal documents, and photographs that fundamentally altered understanding of the Turner case. Virgil Summers, it turned out, had been the attorney who handled old Thomas Turner's estate after his death in 1891. Among his papers was a letter dated November 1890, written by old Thomas Turner himself, apparently seeking legal advice on how to structure his will to ensure his sons continued certain unnamed family traditions after his death. The letter is circumspect but suggestive. Turner writes about maintaining the family arrangement and ensuring that the necessary provisions for continuing the line are protected from outside interference. He asks Summers about the legal status of women who are married but whose marriages are not recorded in official county registers. He inquires about property rights and whether women can claim inheritance or seek divorce if the marriage was performed by a family member rather than a licensed official. Virgil Summers's response, also preserved in the box, is chilling in its pragmatic amorality. He advises Turner that marriages performed without proper licensing are not legally binding, that any women in such arrangements have no legal claim to property or protection under marriage law, and that, as long as no public complaint is made, no authority is likely to interfere in private family arrangements on isolated rural property. In effect, Summers was advising old Thomas Turner on how to keep women in a state of legal non-existence, women who could be married in private ceremony, confined to the property, and disposed of without leaving any official record that they had ever been wives at all. But the most disturbing items in the box were the photographs, 8 of them, mounted in deteriorating cardstock, dating from the 1880s and early 1890s based on photographic technique analysis. 7 of the photographs show women, each posed formally in the style of period portrait photography. They are young women, dressed in simple but respectable clothing, staring into the camera with expressions ranging from resigned to actively fearful. On the back of each photograph is written a date and initials: MC, 1879, SH, 1882, EB, 1886. The 8th photograph is different. It shows the Turner property itself, a wide shot capturing the house, the barn, and several outbuildings. But what makes the photograph significant is what appears in one of the windows of the house: a face, a woman's face. And she is pressing both hands against the glass in exactly the gesture that Reverend Isaiah Blackwood described in his 1881 letter, a gesture of desperate supplication. Dr. Chen's research attempted to match the initials on the photographs to missing women from the period. She had limited success, but she was able to identify 2 with reasonable confidence. MC likely refers to Martha Colson, who married Thomas Turner in a ceremony recorded in family Bible records, but never officially registered with the county. She disappeared from all records after 1880. EB may be Eliza Brennan, a widow who was reported by neighbors to have traveled to the Turner property seeking employment as a housekeeper in 1886. She was never heard from again. The photograph labeled SR 1893 is almost certainly Samantha Russell. The dating matches her marriage year. The woman in the photograph has the right age and general features described in contemporary accounts of Samantha. And the expression on her face, captured in that imperfect 19th century film, communicates such profound hopelessness that Dr. Chen later wrote she could barely stand to examine it. These photographs suggest something even more disturbing than opportunistic abuse by isolated men. They suggest documentation, record-keeping, a systematic process for acquiring and processing these women that was carried out with disturbing bureaucratic regularity. The Turner brothers were not acting on impulse. They were following a procedure established by their father, photographing their victims, keeping records, maintaining a deliberate archive of their crimes. But why photograph them? Dr. Chen speculated that the photographs served as a form of proof to some outside party, evidence that the Turner men were fulfilling some obligation or maintaining some standard. This Theory suggested that the Turner brothers might not have been acting entirely alone, that their activities might have been known or even sanctioned by others in their community who shared similar beliefs about family structure, male dominance, and the status of women as property. This theory remains controversial and unproven, but it's supported by one final piece of evidence from the Summers box. A letter fragment, undated and unsigned, that appears to be from Thomas Turner to an unknown recipient. The fragment reads, "Our arrangement continues as agreed. The third has arrived and is being properly instructed in her duties. Payment can be made when you next visit the property. The previous one has been dealt with according to our understanding." The language suggests a transaction, a business arrangement. Women being acquired through some network or understanding among multiple parties, delivered to the Turner property and dealt with according to some prearranged protocol, when they were no longer useful or became too difficult to control. If this interpretation is correct, then the Turner brothers were not isolated monsters, but participants in a broader system of exploitation, trafficking women through rural Missouri in arrangements that existed entirely outside legal oversight or social accountability. The full scope of this network, if it existed, has never been established. The investigation in the 1970s went nowhere. Too much time had passed. Too many participants were dead. Too many records had been destroyed or never existed in the first place. But the photographs remain. 7 women staring out from time, their names mostly forgotten, their fates documented only in shallow graves behind a demolished farmhouse. And one of those women was Samantha Russell, 19 years old, whose father sold her into hell for $50 and the cancellation of a debt. The Turner story might have ended there, buried with the demolished house and the 7 nameless graves, if not for the persistence of descendants and the occasional surfacing of new evidence across the following decades. In 1956, a woman named Dorothy Russell Haywood contacted the county sheriff's office with information about her great-aunt Samantha Russell. Dorothy was the granddaughter of William Russell's youngest son, making her part of Samantha's extended family. She had grown up hearing whispered stories about the aunt who disappeared into the forest and never came home. Dorothy brought with her a letter that had been preserved in family papers. The letter was dated July 3rd, 1893, approximately 2 months after Samantha's wedding to John Turner. It was addressed to Samantha's father, but had never been mailed. The envelope was sealed but unaddressed, suggesting Samantha had written it but been unable to send it. The letter had been found, Dorothy explained, among items that the Turner brothers returned to William Russell in August of 1893, claiming they were personal effects that Samantha no longer needed. William Russell had opened the sealed letter after his daughter's disappearance, read its contents, and hidden it away without showing it to anyone. It was discovered among his papers after his death by Dorothy's grandmother, who kept it secret out of shame and horror until her own death in 1954. The letter's content provides the only direct testimony from Samantha Russell about her experience at the Turner property. I'm going to read portions of it because no summary can capture the raw terror in her words. "Dear Father, I am writing this in secret and do not know if I will be able to send it. I must tell you what has happened so that if something befalls me, someone will know the truth. The marriage you arranged was not what either of us understood it to be. John Turner shares me with his brother Jacob. They tell me this is their family custom, that their father did. The same with their mother, that this is how the Turner line is maintained. I am not treated as a wife, but as property held in common between them. They do not allow me to leave the house except under direct supervision. They have taken my shoes, so I cannot run. The nearest neighbor is miles away through dense forest, and they have told me that if I try to reach help, they will find me and bring me back, and the punishment will be severe. Father, I am so frightened. There is something wrong with this place beyond what I can properly describe. I have found things hidden in the house, women's clothing that is not mine, names carved into the wooden beams of the attic. Yesterday I found a grave marker in the woods behind the house. It had no name, only a year, 1884. They watch me constantly. They speak to each other in phrases I do not fully understand, but that chill me to my soul. Jacob said yesterday that I am young and strong and will serve the purpose. John said I must learn to accept my station. When I refused their demands 2 nights ago, John struck me across the face. Jacob held me down. I do not know how to escape this place. I think about it constantly, but I see no path. I think they mean to keep me here until I bear children, and then I do not know what they will do with me. I hear sounds at night, Father, crying that seems to come from beneath the house, scraping sounds in the walls. I'm either going mad, or this place holds horrors I cannot yet see. Please, come for me. Please do not abandon me here. I know you needed the marriage arrangement, but I am begging you to find a way to retrieve me. I will die in this place. I feel it in my bones. Please, Father, please. The letter is signed with Samantha's full name and dated. It was never sent because Samantha had no way to send it. When the Turner brothers returned her personal effects to her father weeks later, they included the sealed letter, perhaps as a taunt, or perhaps not realizing what it contained. By the time William Russell read those words, it was already too late to save his daughter. And the guilt of that fact, combined with the explicit description of what he had condemned her to, likely explains why he hid the letter rather than bringing it to authorities. What could he have done? How could he have faced his community, knowing what he had sold his daughter into? How could he have lived with himself? Dorothy Russell Haywood brought this letter forward because, she said, she wanted her great-aunt's suffering to be acknowledged. She wanted it on record that Samantha Russell had been a real person who suffered terribly and deserved to be remembered. The county sheriff in 1956 could do nothing with the letter except file it with the existing Turner case documentation. But Dorothy's act of bringing it forward started something. Other descendants began coming forward with fragments of family knowledge, pieces of the story that had been whispered across generations, but never formally documented. In 1961, a man named Robert Morrison, son of the Thomas Morrison who found the diary in the Turner basement, revealed that his father had found more than just the diary. Hidden in a sealed metal box in the rubble of the house, Thomas Morrison had discovered additional papers, letters written by women who had lived at the Turner property, describing their experiences in terms similar to Samantha's letter. Pleas for help that had never been sent, diary entries that documented abuse, confinement, and terror. Thomas Morrison had been so disturbed by these documents that he had burned most of them, keeping only the leather-bound diary as evidence. But before burning them, he had read them. And according to his son Robert, those readings had haunted Thomas Morrison for the rest of his life. Robert Morrison remembered his father saying that the documents revealed at least 11 different women had been brought to the Turner property. Between 1875 and 1895, some stayed only months before disappearing, others remained for years. The documents suggested that some women had borne children at the property, though no birth records exist for any such children. What happened to those children, if they existed, is unknown. In 1968, another piece of evidence surfaced. A woman named Clara Hensley, whose grandfather was Dutch Henriksen, the farmer who claimed to have heard screaming from the Turner property, revealed that her grandfather had kept a private journal in which he documented disturbing observations about his neighbors. According to this journal, Dutch Henriksen had seen the Turner brothers on multiple occasions, dragging large, heavy objects through the forest in the middle of the night. He had seen them digging behind their house by lantern light. He had once found a trail of blood leading from the Turner property line into the forest, following it until it disappeared at a creek bed. Henriksen had never reported these observations because he was terrified of the Turner brothers and because, in his words, no one in authority would have cared what happened to women in that godless place. He lived with the guilt of his silence until his death in 1923. The Hensley family had kept the journal private out of shame that their grandfather had witnessed potential crimes and done nothing. But Clara Hensley felt that the truth needed to be told, even if it reflected poorly on her ancestor. These later revelations painted a picture of a community that suspected terrible things were happening at the Turner property, but chose collective silence over intervention. Whether this silence stemmed from fear, apathy, misogyny, or a combination of all three is debatable. What's clear is that multiple people had evidence that women were suffering and dying in that isolated farmhouse, and none of them acted decisively enough to stop it. By the yearly time these fragments came together in the 1960s and 70s, everyone directly involved was long dead. The property had changed hands multiple times. The forest had reclaimed the cleared land. Nothing remained of the Turner homestead except a depression in the ground where the foundation had been and a scatter of stones marking what had once been graves. But the story refused to die, because stories of women who vanish into private hells and are never heard from again don't really die. They echo forward through time, waiting for someone to finally listen and bear witness. So what really happened to Samantha Russell and the other women who disappeared into the Turner property? After more than a century of fragmentary evidence, whispered testimony and archaeological discovery, we're left with theories but no definitive answers. The first theory, the one favored by most historians who have examined the evidence, is that the Turner brothers were serial killers operating under the cover of patriarchal marriage customs. They brought women to their property through arrangements that appeared legitimate, confined them in conditions of absolute control, subjected them to sustained physical and sexual abuse, and murdered them when they became too difficult to control or failed to serve whatever purpose the brothers had assigned them. The 7 graves represent some, but possibly not all of their victims, with others disposed of in ways that left no archaeological trace. This theory explains most of the physical evidence. It accounts for the diary, the letters, the photographs, the graves, and the systematic nature of the crimes. It positions the Turner brothers as calculating predators who used legal gaps and social isolation to operate with impunity for decades. The second theory, less commonly accepted but not without support, is that the Turner brothers were not acting entirely alone, but were part of a broader network of men who shared similar beliefs about male entitlement and female subservience. This theory suggests that isolated patriarchal communities in rural Missouri maintained shadow systems for acquiring and controlling women, operating entirely outside legal frameworks. The letter fragment about payment and arrangement supports this interpretation, as does the fact that women seem to arrive at the Turner property through channels that left no official documentation. If this theory is correct, then the Turner brothers were participants in something larger and more organized than individual psychopathy. They were part of a system, and the 7 women buried behind their house represent only a fraction of the women who disappeared into similar arrangements across the rural interior. The third theory, darkest and most speculative, is that some women survived their time at the Turner property, but were so traumatized and socially isolated that they could never come forward. This theory suggests that the children born at the property, if they existed, might have been absorbed into other families through informal adoption, carrying forward the trauma and secrets of their origins. It suggests that descendants of the Turner brothers might still exist, carrying genetic and perhaps psychological inheritance from men who committed atrocities. We don't know which theory is correct. We may never know. The evidence is fragmentary, the witnesses are dead, and time has eroded most of what might have told us the complete truth. What we do know is this: Samantha Russell was 19 years old when she was sold in marriage to John Turner. She lived at the Turner property for approximately 11 months. She tried to communicate her suffering to her father, but failed. She tried to escape but didn't make it beyond the creek bed south of the property. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave where it remained for 44 years until the house finally fell to ruin. She was one of at least 7 women, possibly as many as 11 or more, who suffered similar fates. They were erased from official records, buried in secret, and forgotten by a society that considered their suffering a private family matter unworthy of intervention. To this day, no one has been held accountable for what happened at the Turner property. No one was ever charged with a crime. The case remains officially classified as historical documentation of deaths under suspicious circumstances, not as an active murder investigation. The 7 women in the county cemetery lie under a shared marker that doesn't even name them. This is how women disappeared in the rural interior of 19th century America. Not with dramatic violence or public spectacle, but with quiet, systematic erasure. Marriages arranged for economic convenience, property transfers disguised as domestic arrangements. Suffering that occurred behind locked doors and was met with deliberate blindness by neighbors who didn't want to see. The Turner property still exists, though it looks nothing like it did in Samantha Russell's time. The forest has returned, the graves are gone, the bodies long since relocated. But if you know where to look, you can still find the depression where the foundation once stood. And if you stand there in the quiet, you might imagine what Samantha felt in her final moments, whether she died at her own hand or someone else's, whether she felt relief or rage or simply exhausted resignation. We'll never know, but we can. Bear witness, we can remember her name. We can refuse to let her suffering vanish into historical silence. Tell me in the comments what you think happened to Samantha Russell. Tell me if you think the Turner brothers acted alone or if they were part of something larger. Tell me if you believe justice was ever served, or if cases like this prove that justice is a luxury only some people ever receive. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the women in history who were erased and forgotten, please subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell to join our community of people who refuse to let these stories die. Leave a comment sharing your theories, your thoughts, or your own family stories of women who disappeared into private hells. Until next time, remember that history is not just what's written in official records. It's also what's whispered in family letters, buried in unmarked graves, and preserved in the testimony of those who refuse to forget. Thank you for bearing witness with me to the story of Samantha Russell and the dark pact of the Turner brothers.